Well, welcome back to the Flower Essence podcast, everybody. Today, we are going to talk about Bach flowers and compare them to modern essences. So, I've recently been very immersed in the Bach flowers as I've been working on converting a lot of the Bach flower learning program created by Julian Barnard into a course um, on at the School for Flower Essence Studies in our education platform, and we've have this wonderful partnership with Julian where he's allowed us to take all that content and put it in a course that's for free. So if so it's available now on floweressencestudies.com. And in this process of really diving deep and immersing myself into the Bach flowers, I'm I'm really learning a lot. There is some real fascinating information about Dr. Bach and his life and his whole process of how he came to develop the Bach flowers and sort of a chronological order, what he did, what he found, which flowers he found first, and his whole progression along that process of creating these remedies. And so it's really interesting to think about, well, how they were these were a new things that he kind of put out into the world in the 1930s, and how do they compare with today? How do they compare with the more modern flower essences of today that we talk about so much here on the podcast? And how do people compare? Are our needs the same? Are our needs different? um and a lot of questions we get a lot of questions here on the podcast and in the school about the possibility of combining Bach flowers, and can they be combined with other essences, with modern essences, with gem elixirs, um, other modalities, and that kind of thing. And we do talk about the Bach flowers in the course of the podcast, but we don't really hone in on them so much as their unique and foundational um, the unique and foundational aspects that they have that are so important to our practices. So we just wanted to kind of cover that and see where the conversation goes. So welcome. And of course, Kathleen is here with me and we're ready to chat. So what do you think about this topic?
I was excited when you proposed the topic. I know that you've been just so immersed in the Bach essences over the last few months to prepare this amazing kind of the way that you've created the course. It's so logical and easy to know. It's very orderly. You've got such a wonderful organizing mind. So you've been able to really bring all the parts together so that you can start wherever you want, and you can dip back in and find what you were looking for. So I really encourage anybody listening who's interested in learning the Bach essences to join the course. It's totally free. Always is going to be free. And just use it to the degree that serves you. We are really excited about the depth of information available. And also just know that it's a great place to learn about one particular essence that's maybe in your formula and you wanted to learn more about it. So I like this question of, are they still relevant? Because, I think that I can, spoiler alert, yes, still definitely relevant. We're not that different, even though perhaps we look at images of the 1930s and see how much has changed. But on many, many levels, we are very, very similar. And Dr. Bach's inspiration of working with people or offering remedies to them based on their sort of personality construct or the way that they responded to life was brilliant and wonderful. And so I think we've still got a lot to learn from the Bach remedies, and there's a lot that they can do to help us. And like you said, Ro, I agree too that they are foundational to the practice of flower essence therapy.
Yeah, I just want to make a note because we've had the comment before that we're pronouncing it wrong. Bach. So, what I've heard is that that it's supposed to be batch, and Julian Barnard says Bach or Bach, and what he says is that in that time around the First World War, it was very unpopular to have a German sounding name. And so that might be why the pronunciation went to Batch. But he uses the more traditional pronunciation. Of course, I don't think I can ever change because I started saying it Bach. So however you say it, that's who we're talking about. We all have different accents and different ways that we enunciate it, and I think that it's fine. So just in case you're wondering, I think that all of the versions are correct.
Yeah, we're American here. We are using the American pronunciation, kind of the standard American pronunciation. So we respect everyone else. Just we're all talking about the same thing. It's kind of like speaking botanical Latin. It's like, are you understood? Okay, that's what's important. So thank you very much. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Do you want to dig into a little bit about the modern versus these kind of classic Bach essences? I would start that conversation with the 1930s of when Dr. Bach discovered these essences, developed these essences, whatever word you want to use. Keep in mind his history and what was going on in the world at the time. He graduated from medical school in 1912 as a young man in his early 20s. And 1914 was the beginning of World War I. 1914 to 1918. So he was a surgeon and a doctor through that entire period of World War I, which was, just a staggering number of deaths. I looked it up this morning and it was 15 million deaths in World War I. So he was so deeply immersed in human suffering from being a doctor, from living in England during that time frame of World War I. And after the war, there was, England was very economically depressed, and it became even worse in the 1930s because the U.S. stock market crashed, and things went from bad to worse. There was extraordinary poverty in England. There was extraordinary, just ongoing grief from the losses. Like everyone had lost someone in World War I. And they were going through this just staggeringly painful time. And the British people, it was like, stiff upper lip. And yet there was so much suffering. There was so much suffering. And I have to feel like as a sensitive, I'm gonna say I'm pretty sure Bach was a sensitive also, to be just immersed in that for the whole of your adult life, and then for things to get even harder during the Depression, during that time. And he, dumped his practice and moved off to the country in 1930. And it's just to look at that era of what he was going through. And then in the mid 30s, he died, I think it was 36, 37, right around that time. I don't have that date written down. But in the early 30s, there was this rise of fascism. And, and there was a period of appeasement of Hitler. And that was just coming down the road. World War II started in 1938. So it's in this interwar period that the Bach essences were created. So just to set the framework of when these came into the world, that quality of grief, of despair, of distress from enduring one extraordinary war that they thought they called it the Great War, and millions of people died. And then to look down the barrel of the next war, which nobody wanted and yet came upon them. I don't think you can ignore that as being part of what brought these essences into the world. And I don't think that they can possibly be considered not relevant now because, now.
Yeah, absolutely relevant. And then looking at not just what was happening in the world, but also his own trajectory as a brilliant medical doctor. He invented the Bach nosodes. So basically, this was a sort of vaccination. It started out as being a vaccination of for treating like intestinal toxemia by in on an individual basis, which was taking like the fecal matter of somebody very chronically ill, very sick, and purifying it or making it dormant, and then making a solution that then got injected back into the person. And so it was a form of vaccination that was very successful. But he wanted to not treat one person at a time. He wanted to make a polyvalent treatment that could work on multiple people. And he started looking at the ways of categorizing these illnesses. And at that time too, he was a very much into the homeopathy. And Samuel Hahnemann, one of the creators of homeopathy, and all of his methods. And so he was using that as a way to develop homeopathic nosodes, because he also didn't like the idea of injecting and creating a hole in the barrier of the body. So he was very much on these medical frontiers, and he was noticing more and more in his very successful medical practice, uh, the personalities and the emotional and spiritual struggles of the people and the patients walking into his office. And he was able to start being able to kind of um, categorize people by their mannerisms, by the way they acted. He kind of started to know immediately what would help them just by the way they walked into the door and talked to him. And so this is the very beginnings of basically flower essence therapy. While at the same time in the medical world, penicillin was found, and that part of medical um, science really went down the path of treating um, bacteria with penicillin. It's like a physical cause only, not separating out the emotional and spiritual, where he was so uh, interested in that more holistic approach and treating this mental, emotional, spiritual um, part of disease, thinking that that was the key. And so that is the time where he decided to quit his practice and went to the country. And then, like, the rest is history, as they say. He started finding these flowers and creating these essences. So it's a really interesting, his personal background. And amongst all that, I believe he was diagnosed with cancer in 1917. So he did eventually die from that in 37, I think. Um, but it's interesting, a lot of his notes and his writings he destroyed. So, there's just a lot of conjecture, and we can only imagine what he must have personally gone through and been going through as he treated. And we don't know exactly how he treated his cancer, but he must have put it in remission for a good number of years while he was on this sort of mission. This is his life's purpose of creating these essences. And as he created them, he took them and he knew how they affected him, and then he wrote about them and gave them to others to experiment with and try.
And that process, that healing journey that one goes through when one makes essences, when one studies them profoundly and deeply, like he did. I think that you and I are really interested in exploring that in a future podcast, because that's been part of both of our processes too, of healing, of spending time with the plants and creating these essences. And as you do, it changes you. It's, taking essences is one thing, but when you are actually able to spend that immerse in that healing field when an essence is created. It's something different altogether. So it's, the and it's very tiring too. It's really intense. And you can also experience that on some level, by the level of study that you've been doing, Ro, with this, bringing these essences into this format of this intensive study and intensive immersion in this course. I think that it's been kind of, I wouldn't say an eye opener, but kind of like, whoa, okay, there's a lot going on in here. Maybe you want to mention some of the essences that you've been working with, because one of the pieces that we're looking towards bringing forward with the flower essence studies is developing some groups of people to work really deeply with these essences. Of a lot of us know them on a very shallow level, and we'd really like to encourage that depth. So just a little bit of a promo.
Yeah, and I'll admit, like, when I started really getting it, I mean, Bach flowers are what I started with, of course, as probably everybody has. We find the rescue remedy in the store and may go further with some of the single remedies. Um, but the minute I learned how to make a flower essence, like, I just completely, went in my own direction, let's say. And I sort of discounted the Bach flowers. I thought, that was from a long time ago. I really also feel it's important to work with the the flora where we live, and around us. And I didn't have a lot of experience with a good portion of the Bach plants. So they didn't resonate with me as much. And I sort of went in my own direction and really like the California flowers, and the flowers that are made from herbs that we use in herbalism, because that's where my plant education really started. So there's a few, that are kind of the tried and true Bach essences that seem to find their way, and that there isn't really anything better. And I think, and then there's a whole lot more of modern essences that I think there is a difference, of course, and I think that they speak to more, I think that we have evolved and that there is more to work with. But that doesn't take away from the fact that these foundational challenges that the Bach flowers addressed exist, because they absolutely do. And sometimes they underlie all of the sort of more surface challenges that we might start working with. So I think that, and the rescue remedy is the one that I just absolutely, it probably, I don't know, it was part of such a transformation in the beginning that probably, saved my life. And I just have so much respect for it, and so much, I just, it's so critical. It's such a critical part. But as far as other ones that I tend to use a lot right now, um, I think that for me personally, with dealing with aspects of some chronic illness that, engender chronic fatigue, the olive is one that I really tend to rely on. And then as somebody, and that is so valid for today. I mean, more than ever, I think, because there's more chronic autoimmune illnesses than there ever were in the world. And there is so much exhaustion and just that total state, that state of just complete and total exhaustion, whether it's transitory or every day. And I think that olive really brings that strength. It just helps to access your internal strength for dealing with everyday small things. So that's a good example, I think, um, of something that was relevant back then, but even more so, I think, today. What do you have more examples? I know I have a few more too.
Oh yeah, we could do this all day. Um, I completely agree with the olive. It I just imagine and think of the olive tree. If you've ever seen a really old olive tree, they have an extraordinary potential for longevity, and the climate in which they grow, their native habitat, it's hot and dry, and so you've got this image of extraordinary longevity in a circumstance that's not easy, right? It's not lush and green and, the living is easy. It's not. It grows in hard, dry, hot, arid circumstances and produces, something that's a fruit and an oil that's life-giving for the people in the area. So I always look at that olive as being this extraordinary example of resiliency, of somehow nourishing oneself in order to keep going and to keep working and to keep doing what you're doing in a way that's sustainable. They don't produce olives every single day of the year. It's important to realize what one's limits are. And olive, I think, helps to teach us that. Elm is one that I've been thinking about a lot lately. It's, the classic way to remember it is when you're feeling overwhelmed. It's sort of a joke, but it also really works because there's so much mental input and so much sort of data flying at us all the time. All the to-do lists and this, on my desk, the sticky notes and the open files, and like, oh my God, it's just so much. And so the elm really helps you to like summon a level of courage of like, okay, that's not that important. Okay, I'm going to focus on this and get this done. Helps you kind of reground. And I know that quality of grounding is one that we've been talking about a lot together.
Elm is really one of my most used Bach flower remedies. It is, if if Bach could only imagine what life would be like today, right? I mean, the he lived at a time where there was there wasn't, I think that most people, only rich people had electricity. There wasn't an internet. There wasn't a way to get news and information other than the pamphlets that people would print. And that's that's literally how people would have public arguments, was to print a pamphlet about something. I mean, that was the way that information flowed. Yeah, that's how they dropped propaganda. They dropped pamphlets from planes. I can if you can just imagine the speed of information now compared to the speed of information then, and the the way that we have the world at our fingertips. And I think it's easier to imagine because I was born before the internet was available. So for those who were born later, it might just be impossible to imagine. But thinking even back, I mean, so far ago, I mean, this was almost 100 years ago, and life did not have the complexity that it does now. And so elm is an absolute brilliant key flower remedy for today, for the information age, and for the age of being completely um we don't have as much community support or family unit to share burdens. So we have more probably burdens on individuals than used to be, than there used to be in the past, I would imagine. And then along those lines, I wanted to add Vervain to the mix, because Vervain was even spoken about as a very modern remedy by Nikki Murray in the 70s. And that is one that is for the overactivity of the mind, the stress and strain that causes, and the physical tension that causes in the body, for people who are really like workaholics. Work is um people get, and I get it, because I get like this. When I get hyper focused on something, I just can't stop, and I get to the point where I'm not taking care of myself. And that's a really common thing, I think, too. Just the pressures of the job, the pressures of work, the never-ending to-do list. And for some people, the way of dealing that is just go, 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 go. And some personalities really have that more than others, but I can see it as not just for a type A personality, but really anyone who is just, working too hard. And aren't we all right now? I mean, like, that seems to be the way life has evolved. We don't have leisure time like we, like people evidently used to. I don't know what what that is anymore, right? It's so common to not have um downtime, or and when we do, we're on our phone, so we don't have true downtime. And then it kind of gets into this cycle of stress. And so Vervain is a key one for me, not just the flower essence, but the herb. And the herb has a very similar indication. It's, if you have that tension in the neck and shoulders, and you just can't like bring your shoulders down from your head, and you have that kind of intense work stress, Vervain is a wonderful nervine to explore from the herbal realm. And the flower essence, to me, it works in much the same way, as far as not so much the physical, a direct physical, but an indirect physical, by really working with that, enabling um a relaxation of kind of letting go from this stiff structure of the mind that's happening.
It's so interesting, like you're talking about how this Vervain personality type, the classic, they call the type A personality. Um, it's almost as if culture has decided that everyone should be that, right? I mean, you look at how jobs are described, welcome to our paced environment. We need somebody who can, and it's as if the only acceptable type of human is this type of human, because that's what's good for companies. That's what's good for commerce. Seriously, the whole world is revolving around as if it's trying to turn us into, super high powered robots. Like, that's not being a human, and that's not healthy for humans. It's not a good thing for us to do all the time. So I love I love Vervain also, because it's such an important essence to kind of counteract that programming that we should be on all the time, that we should be, producing and, reacting and, like, oh yeah, yeah. I love the image of the pamphlets coming out of the sky. That's delightful. As opposed to Twitter, right? It's okay. So yeah, we really need some counteraction of that, of the modern era of this ridiculous notion that we should be adrenalized all the time. It's so depleting for our nervous systems. Imagine why we're all sick all the time. An essence that I've been working with personally lately, that I really hadn't paid a lot of attention to. So it's been really fun to get ready for this course, and to get ready to work with students in this course, going back to the basics, right? Like going back to these originating essences, which, like you're saying, they kind of get like, oh yeah, that was then. And, there's a few that, yeah, we can't go without, but, there's all these other ones that are like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. And for me, one of those was honeysuckle. I never really paid a lot of attention to it. The basic description is, somebody who kind of lives in the past, and, kind of morose and all that. And lately that's how I've been feeling. And, when I looked for essences and dowsed for essences, and honeysuckle came up, I went, okay, that's interesting. And then I've looked into it a little bit more, because it wasn't something that I'd really worked with much. And, the last few years have been rough. In 17, here in Sonoma County, we had these just harrowing firestorm, where we had, basically 5,000 homes burned overnight, roughly. It's like the firestorm went on for a week, but most of the houses were lost in that first night. I mean, I'm not talking structures, I'm talking homes. And it was just so shocking. And it was so stressful and terrifying to be in that. And, we weren't sure for a week of whether the fire was going to explode and burn us too. And so to be in that state of nervous exhaustion, and then it happened again 2 years later, and then it happened again the year after that. And so there's that deep level of nervous system exhaustion that's been taking place from that in our area. Other areas have other crises too. It's not not just fires, but there's tornadoes, and there's enormous storms, and all sorts of things are happening all over. And then of course we have the pandemic, and it's just been years and years and years and years. And it's, on some level, I've been feeling really like, what's next? What on earth are we going to do? Um, you know, it feels really hopeless, and, nothing's going to get better. And so the honeysuckle has been really helpful. I've just kind of been taking it for maybe a week now, and it's like, oh yeah, okay. And so it did stimulate tears. It did stimulate, release of grief that I've been holding. There's been a lot of loss, and yet I can kind of feel a little bit of a dawn arising, from taking this essence and immersing into it. So I'm really grateful for honeysuckle in a way that I wasn't, a few weeks ago.
Yeah, it's, challenge after challenge. And I'm sure that that applies to the whole world. I know um, it just seems like since 2017, there's been one thing after the other. Exactly. And one essence that I had used in the beginning and was drawn to a lot was wild rose, but I never quite understood it that well. I feel like, there's so many roses, and there's different rose essences, and there's different wild rose essences. And I was never quite sure, with a Bach one versus the California wild rose. So I tended to stick with the California wild rose because that's California, and that's the rose that I see growing around here. So I had more of a relationship with it. Um, but I feel like the Bach wild rose uh is is not just appropriate for today, and this is an essence that works with apathy. And apathy that is not it's it's born from challenges that once somebody realizes they can't change the circumstance. So it's not like an inherent personality trait of apathy. It's more um, that somebody's got a chronic illness and they finally kind of not give up, but accept it in an apathetic way. Like, this is what's happening now. And we do, I mean, it's a valid response to these, to something that you realize can't be changed. But I was just thinking about it recently, how it's almost like a flagship essence for Generation X, for our generation, that so we grew up, you know, I think when we were very young, there was this threat of the Cold War turning into World War III, which, guess what? We're sort of there again. But when we were growing up, it was kind of like we just thought that, I don't know about you, but none of us thought that we'd basically survive as a planet into it. Like, I didn't even imagine myself becoming an adult, because I didn't think that, it would happen. So it's kind of a weird a weird thing to grow up with. And I think that that's part of the overall generational attitude, and to make a very general statement about our generation. And I had never really put that together before, because I don't think of myself as an apathetic person. I mean, I deeply care about too many things, but I do have that sort of undercurrent, and I can feel that undercurrent in a lot of, in the generation. And how interesting is that? The wild rose is sort of perfect for the situations where we fall back into the trauma response of giving 0 Fs about something, um, because that's easier, because that's a way of handling it, when maybe that's not always the best way of handling it. What do you think about that?
I'm laughing at your experience because it's like, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a doomsday cult. I mean, they had like the dates of when the world was going to end and all that. So I was in the womb. I was exposed to like the world's about to end, the world's about to end, and you know, uh, so yeah, it is crazy. I mean, I grew up in and it was such a bizarro world because they really didn't think that there was a future. They didn't, I was raised that there wasn't going to be a future. I mean, there wasn't really much of an emphasis on career planning because there's no future, right? It's like go to college, you're never going to live till college, that things are going to be totally different. We're going to be in this place of safety. Like it was this bonkers world. So planning, future planning, like none of that happened. So I completely get this thing because at the end of that, getting out of that experience, I didn't have any skills or tools. I mean, and it is like that era thing of making goals, making future plans, like that. Why even consider such a thing? It's just time wasted. And so yeah, there was a long era of the dude abiding, as it were. Right? That's just like, okay, just don't care anymore. So yeah, I think we can kind of relate to that wild rose scenario.
Yeah, and Generation X gets a bad rap for not caring or being apathetic, when really a lot of times it's just not caring about what the marketers or the powers that be want you to care about. So it's a little bit, it's I just wanted to say that in our defense. But but yeah, and the it's interesting to think of it as a trauma response, and it makes so much sense. And I'm sure Dr. Bach probably saw that as well, because of what was going on with the Great War, and you know all of the things that came out of that the horrors that we're seeing, and how it affected people. So um yeah,
Well, it was
it's
that
really
interwar
amazing.
period, between the two great wars.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that level of trauma response, of apathy, of that feeling of helplessness. That's exactly Wild Rose.
And also, I went I when he was doing all of this and treating patients, it was before there was national health care. And so I would imagine that, he was seeing only the people that could afford, to pay him. And then given the state of the medical world, he was getting all these chronic cases that weren't being solved anywhere else, and came to him. So by the time, somebody would get to him, I would imagine that they, were pretty defeated, and either apathetic or completely defeated and given up hope, which is another state. Um, but I would imagine that that was a very much a thing, given that there wasn't really health care in England at that time.
Well, in the level of economic depression and poverty, I see that as being part of his impulse of going to the country, trying to find something that would help people, that didn't cost a lot of money, that was something that anybody could have in their hands, and to be able to help themselves, to help their family, to help people that they cared about, for that as an originating impulse. You can see in that time that made a lot of sense, rather than his personal experience of being a physician on, sort of the fanciest street in London, seeing the people who had the most resources to spend. And he just, wanted to help more people than just the elites, right? And so he decided to see what he could do by working with people without those sorts of means, and created this beautiful system that's a gift to the world, that all of us can access without needing to have tons of money to do so.
Yeah. And talking about blending, I'd like to answer that question before we have to wrap up. And we get this question a lot because there are some schools of thought that say you shouldn't blend Bach flowers with other flower essences. But Steve Johnson had a saying, there's no bias in nature. So, that totally applies. And that is how I think of it. I know you think of it. I know a lot of people think of it, that there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to mix flower essences from one manufacturer or line with another. And that's kind of the grounding principle of our school. It's really foundational in that nature doesn't have a bias. Nature, we should be able to combine as it makes sense with the framework that we're using, flower essences with gem elixirs, with environmental essences, with essences from all around the world, and whatever makes sense for that person.
Agreed. And I would love to add this piece that you just mentioned, the mixing of the essences, whether you feel like and we support you wherever you are. We're just giving our expression of, this is what we do. So yes, we do mix the Bach essences with other essences. We find they play well with others. And we really like and encourage the use of using gem elixirs and environmentals, like you were mentioning. But that's something that we've really been paying attention to, that how useful and important we find it to have some gem essence in with your blend. That was one of the things that I was taught early on, is that sometimes we take flowers and flowers and flowers, and they can create these expansions or these releases. And sometimes we can get a little bit ungrounded, or a little overdone. And that the inclusion of a gem essence in your formula really helps to stabilize your physical energetic body, in order to accommodate those changes and shifts. I'm not sure if that's how you would say it, Ro, but I always try to include something from the gem category, and often an environmental as well. The one thing before I jump into you, I really want to encourage those who joined us for the Flower Essence Alchemy event, to take a look, or you can still do that. You can still join in, to watch Nicholas Pearson's talk on gem elixirs and the categorizations of the different gems, and how they, there's an organizing principle there too. So that's really gotten my mind thinking, to be thinking about using gem elixirs really much more accurately and more potently. But definitely think about adding some gem elixirs to your collections, that you can be putting them in your formulas as well.
The longer I work as a flower essence practitioner and use the essences myself, the more important the gem elixirs have become. And the exactly what you're saying, there's a grounding and stabilization that happens that you just don't get from the flower essences or plant essences. Um, and I was recently watching a video on YouTube, because there's some great videos on the Alaskan Essences YouTube channel that have recordings of Steve Johnson speaking about gem essences. And similar to what you were saying about the flower essences expanding consciousness and the gem elixirs um, bringing them back in, like in helping to integrate that expansion back into the body, um, is what I had been feeling personally about it. But Steve Johnson mentioned something interesting that I hadn't quite thought about, and it makes so much sense. And that is that the longer somebody works with flower essences, the more they need it, the more they need that integration and that grounding, because their expansion is so much more, or their, the consciousness or how they've expanded in their healing journey working with essences is so much more that they need even more of that integration and that grounding into the body than, say, someone who's never taken an essence before, where maybe the Bach flowers are just perfectly fine for that person. And I look at that too, looking at where we're talking about what's the difference between life in the 1930s and people in the 1930s versus today. And, we've had such an explosion of self-help and self-actualization and working on consciousness, and just with some people individually, but also just sort of um just the whole world is sort of it's different in that sense, that there's more awareness about so many more things. And so I would think that if Bach were alive today and he'd had this and seen this progression and had this experience, he would be in agreement with. I would think that he would be in total agreement with that now, and especially after so much time of working with essences. I mean, we've both been working with essences in our own lives and practice longer than Dr. Bach did you know, in his life in creating those. So, I think there's just it's really valid to that we evolve. We need to evolve with that process, both personally and collectively.
With, respect and gratitude and appreciation for those who have come before. It's one of our, personal principles and our school's founding principles that we look back to the ones who came first, came before us, and we are just carrying that forward and growing it with our own unique selves, but really thankful and grateful for the originating work from our teachers and going all the way back to Dr. Bach. And thank you, Julian Barnard, for bringing this work into the modern era with such integrity and rigor. The level of work that Julian has put his entire lifetime into of doing this research and furthering the use of the Bach essences. We just have such deep appreciation, and thank you so much, Julian, for the gift of allowing us to host your Bach Flower Learning Program on flower essence studies. It's an extraordinary honor, and we really, really appreciate you and your work and want more people to know about it.
Ditto to all of that. And it's such an honor and wonderful to be able to follow in the footsteps of presenting this making this information available for free, because that's what Dr. Bach did. He printed his books and his pamphlets, and he thought it was important that this was information that anyone could have, that there were no hierarchies, there were no barriers, that anyone could and should have the information about the Bach essences. And then once Julian Barnard, who worked for the Bach Center, developing the Bach Flower Learning Program initially, and then went on to individually have it and host it as he does today, he also felt that importance of the lineage that he had and passing that information along. for free. And so now we're part of the lineage moving forward, moving forward and being able to bring that information to a broader audience um, as part of our platform. And I feel really honored. I just feel so honored to be able to just be part of this lineage and to be able to make this information available to anyone who's interested. So take a look, and you can find it on floweressencestudies.com. It's the Julian Barnard's Bach Flower Learning Program, and it's there for you. So take a look.
On that note, thanks for being with us. We love to talk together. We love to be together in this space of talking about the plants, of bringing this knowledge into the world and sharing our experiences. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening and for spreading flower essences in the world everywhere you go, because we know each and every one of you who listens shares this knowledge and information with other people. And we're all just together holding hands, sharing this information into the world and helping people feel better.